life a lot easier. And I'm saying that with a lot of conviction. We are all interested in building great apps with FHIR, but let's face it, there's a lot of infrastructure that we as developers either have to master, contract out, or in other ways we get entangled with, and we would like ways to make our lives simpler. So that's what I'm going to talk about. API management, how we could make FHIR applications a lot easier for you to develop. I got an action-packed agenda here. We're going to talk a little bit about basic terms and functions of API managers, but most of this session is going to be demos. So you won't have to hear me talking. You're going to actually see how to do this. And then we'll wrap up. If I can't get to all your questions, I promise I will answer in chat. So why is API management important for FHIR? Well, there's something called an API management lifecycle, and it starts with development and exposing what our FHIR servers can do, how to access them, making it easy for developers to know how to query or otherwise post resources to our server. But there are many things that we have to do at an operational level. We have to be able to secure the FHIR server. We have to support the ability to scale it. From a HIPAA standpoint, we have to provide an audit trail of our requests and responses. And operationally, we need to understand what our FHIR server is doing in terms of performance and other metrics. So that's what API managers do. So let's look at some of their basic functions and some basic terms. In terms of the functions, as I mentioned, it's full life cycle. So we start with the creation and publishing of FHIR APIs and making them easy for developers to understand. We can enforce usage policies through security controls that the API manager helps us enforce. We could control access to traffic. We could collect and analyze usage statistics of the server. We could do performance reporting. We could use it as a gateway, so we could actually use it to put multiple FHIR servers behind if we want to. There are a lot of terms in this field, but I think in a nutshell, there's only three you need to know. One, service. What a service is an endpoint that our FHIR gateway or API gateway is going to use to refer to an upstream API. And the biggest service we want to manage here is our FHIR server. And then there are routes. These are paths to the service. The gateway is going to forward requests coming into the route to the service as we set up these routes. And the final concept is a consumer. They're the end users of the API. They're the clients. And we need to identify them if we're going to use security and logging properly. So here's what it looks like. And here I'm illustrating Kong. Kong is open source, but there are many other API managers. They all work about the same. There's an API client, and that client has consumers, identified consumers that are going to hit routes that go to services. And then finally, there's a load balancer that will manage where those requests are being fielded to our upstream targets. So what are the advantages of using this? Well, you don't need to worry about all the authentication logic. You don't need to worry about logging. You could customize API functionality without having to build it all yourself. And that's really, really good news. I'm not plugging Kong here, but the Kong Community Edition has lots of great features. We can't even discuss them all. Very scalable, modular, and it runs on any infrastructure. It's open source. You could pull it from Docker Hub, and or you can go to the Kong website and get it for your use. Well, let's start off with looking at the first part of the API lifecycle, the development portal. All of us know that FHIR is a complex standard. Many developers are just learning now. wouldn't it be great if you could expose all these FHIR resources to make their understanding by other developers and users easier and faster? And there are definitely ways to do that. And the way to do that is to create an open specification, an open API specification that explains what that FHIR server does. It will explain the endpoints, interactions, the paths, parameters, and responses of that server. And I'm going to show you exactly how that is done. So let me show you this in the first demo here, and we'll get started.
Probably the best way to expose your FHIR resources and the capabilities of your FHIR server is through OpenAPI. There are a number of open source tools available. One I could recommend to you is Swagger.io, what you see here. You could sign in for a free account.
And Patrick, I apologize. We are not seeing your video.
To load many resources.
Not seeing the video?
Nope, we are seeing a transition from the PowerPoint.
Okay, let me.
I also don't see the video.
Okay, I'm trying to get the.
Nobody sees the video.
All right, hang on. Can you see it now?
We are seeing, yep, your browser there, API development.
Yes.
Probably the best way to expose your FHIR resources and the capabilities of your FHIR server is through OpenAPI. There are a number of open source tools available. One I could recommend to you is Swagger.io, what you see here. You could sign in for a free account, but to load many resources, you will need a paid account. So let's just see how this works. I'm going to sign into my account. And log in here. And what you see is some resources that I've translated from FHIR R4 into the OpenAPI spec. So let's just take a look at one of these resources. And what you see are really three panels. Over here on the left side is the patient resource and the different interactions like post and get, and the different paths that are supported by that interaction. You also see models, and these are really the definitions in the FHIR R4 spec in OpenAPI. To use the portal fully, you need to translate these FHIR resources into the OpenAPI spec. And as you can see here, I've done this. You have the information, the title, description. What you need to provide is a host so that you can then allow others to easily experiment and test with your OpenAPI definitions and the base path to your server and what schemes it's supported, etc. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to write these definitions. The last panel is really how people who are new to FHIR and your development team can easily test FHIR resources. So here we see a GUI version of the patient resource. So let's go down to get patient by ID, for example. We'll click on that. And at this point, people can, without any knowledge of curl or HTTP, could come in and actually experiment with this. So we'll say, let's try out this resource. And I happen to know patient number 6 is in our system, so I'm going to go ahead and execute that. And the first thing you see is, hey, if you were to try to get this resource using curl, here is the command that you would write at the command line. The same thing here if you were to request this with HTTP. we get a response code of
But
200, and we see that response body. So again, this is a very simple way to experiment and play with FHIR, but it all relies on effectively having an OpenAPI spec. Now, to get those OpenAPI specs, you're going to need an editor. Here I'm showing you Visual Studio Code. And you need to translate the capabilities of your FHIR server into OpenAPI definitions. One extension that I'll recommend that makes this a little bit easier is a extension for Visual Studio Code called OpenAPI Editor. This does a lot of things like, for example, highlighting of definitions and code completion, and it'll help you make fewer errors when translating FHIR into OpenAPI, the OpenAPI spec. It also uses a format called YAML. As you can see, it has a lot of indenting here. But what you need to do is specify every path that an interaction that your server supports, the parameters, response codes, etc. Probably the most tedious thing, and maybe the hardest, is just effectively creating all the model definitions. There's just a lot of them, and it could take a lot of time. That's why I think in the future we're going to see that the most convenient way to do this is just using commercial servers where these have already been done for you and loaded into the system, such as ours. So I think that is going to be by far easier because there's really just thousands and thousands of lines of code in doing this. There are some tools like FHIR Swagger IO that make this a little bit easier, but still there's a need for creating and annotating your definitions for your particular server. So I've gone back to the Swagger IO website, and now I'm going to show you how you could create a new definition using the YAML code I showed you in the Visual Studio Code editor. I'm going to go ahead and click on creating a new OpenAPI definition. And I am not going to use any template. And let's just call this, this is going to be based on the observation resource. So we'll type that in. It's the first version that I've made. And it's going to be the FHIR observation. And we can create a brief description here. And immediately what you see is some stub code definitions for this FHIR resource. Now, obviously, it's showing us a mock server that we need to replace with our definition of our particular server. Well, we've already created that with Visual Studio Code. So all we really need to do is replace this entire definition with our created definition. And you see we have a valid response. And now we can exploit this by using the GUI. We could query for a different resource worth one of many parameters that are exposed. And so let's just try a parameter like the laboratory code, a LOINC code that will supply. And so we'll test this out, and I've selected the code 6189-5. I've looked this up in advance, obviously, but we could go ahead and test that out. We'll go down to the bottom and we'll execute the code. or execute the request. And again, you see the what that request would look like in curl HTTP. And now we get back a bundle with 2 resources in it. And if we scroll down a little bit, we could see it's a laboratory observation. You see the LOINC code, and we see the description for it, which is an antibody to white oak. So this is really simple. We could then, if we want to analyze it further, we could download the JSON and do any kind of other processing. But I hope this kind of gives you an idea of how you can use a development portal and OpenAPI to expose your FHIR resources.
All right, great. Now let's switch gears here a little bit.
Patrick, if you can make it full screen, it would be better.
I am trying to. I'm going to close this and see.
Yep, and it looks like you've stopped sharing there, Patrick.
Okay, I'm trying to share my screen again. And can you see my screen, I hope?
Yep, we're seeing your PowerPoint there in edit mode.
Great. Okay, now.
And full screen. Yep, looks good.
Good. Yeah. So that was a really quick tour of the development environment. For a commercial server like ours, we include all these OpenAPI definitions in a catalog, so that makes it easy for you to explore. And I won't cover much more of that because I need to really help set the stage for what does the API manager do and what are the things that it's controlling. Well, we have a number of clients that are going to be hitting our API gateway. Behind that, we're going to have a number of cloud services. Got a FHIR service running in AWS. That's an InterSystems FHIR service, and I'm using Loggly for logging. We also have an admin portal that will control the gateway so that we can configure it, and a number of services running on my local machine that are going to do analytics. What you're going to see initially is how we set this up using the admin portal. And so without further ado, I'm going to go right to showing you how this, this works. I hope you could see it. This is as full screen as I could make it, unfortunately. All right, we're ready to start configuring an API manager. And just to review why we need to do this is that we're going to have a variety of services, not just the FHIR server that we're trying to manage, but also monitoring and logging services that we're going to need with that service. Additionally, we want to have the ability to secure it, and we're going to use Kong as a gateway to do that. Needless to say, we have to orchestrate many different server services, and the best way to do that is with Docker. Now, I don't have the time to spend a lot of cycles talking about Docker. It's a very good way in which you can manage a lot of different services. You configure them through what is called a Docker compose file, what you're seeing here. And this specifies a lot of configuration parameters, including the ports. If you have a database, it can configure that. We're going to configure a GUI environment to use with Kong to control it. And we could have a local FHIR service and then these monitoring services. Needless to say, this can be fairly daunting and complex. That's why I'm going to recommend to you that you consider using our service, what's already pre-configured. We have this up on Git and GitHub, and you can basically download this for free and use the FHIR server in conjunction with API management that is already pre-configured out of the box. But obviously you could use any number of API managers, and that's really, I'm not trying to promote just this one. Let's see what we need to do to configure an API manager. Well, the first step is that we're going to need to bring up a terminal window and launch all those containers. And this is where that Docker compose file comes in. We could basically bring up all the containers with a single command, docker compose up, and you'll see that we'll be creating a new network for those containers to communicate with each other, and it takes very little time, and all of these containers will be launched and working. Now, to validate that, we could just simply issue another Docker command called docker ps, and you'll see these containers have all been launched and are running. So far so good. The next step is that we want to communicate with Kong to configure it and do those basic tasks that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. So we need a new window for this. We're going to basically go to the Kong admin portal called Konga, and that's working on port 1337. The first thing we need to do is log in. As you can see, mine is already pre-configured. We'll sign in. And now it's going to ask us for a setup connection. And we can name this anything we want. I'm going to call it FHIR Kong for now. And we need to know what is the address of the Kong service. Where is that running? Well, in this demo, it's running in a container at this IP address. And the Kong container always is running at port 8001. So we'll create that connection, and it looks like it's connected successfully. We could, again, look at that in the connections thing. We could deactivate this, but for now, we're going to go directly to creating a service. So as we mentioned earlier in the beginning, there are three major concepts for any API manager. There's a concept of a service, there's a concept of routes, and a concept of consumers. The services are the things you want to manage. In our case, it's our FHIR server. So let's take a look at where that service lives. That is going to be on AWS, and we'll just launch Postman. And we'll see if we could communicate with that server. Now notice it is a very long URL string. We're going to just go ahead and get the metadata for that server. So we'll send a request, and you could see the server is up and running on AWS. It's an R4 server, and we can get all the capability information. Now, that's great. What we'd like to do is now, instead of using this is our endpoint essentially. We'd like to get that endpoint. And I'm having a little trouble copying it here, but okay, we'll copy this endpoint. And that's the service we want Kong to manage. So we're going to just go ahead and add it. And we'll just call this FHIR service. The description, we don't have to have this, but we could just call this an R4 FHIR server. And now we need that URL string. That's going to tell Kong where it can find this service. So we'll just go paste that in. We won't need to fill out the protocol host port because all of that can be parsed from that string. So we'll, oh, and we have a schema violation. Invalid value, just correct that. And we have a FHIR service. Let's just take a look quickly. You could see that it did parse the URL string, so it knows what protocol to communicate with that service, the host, the port, etc., and the path on it. Great. So we're continuing to do configuration, and now once we have a service, we could add routes to it. And we could add as many routes as we want. These will just be passed to this service that Kong will forward request coming through that route. And so let's make this a little more concrete. I'll call this the main route. And I'm going to just list the path to this route, a very simple R4 path instead of that big long URL string. And I'll go ahead and submit that path, and I'll submit this route. And you could see Kong took this as our main route. And so that's great. Now we're ready to be able to test that and see if we can call our FHIR service using the Kong portal. So we'll go back to Postman. And now we would like to do a server request. And I'm just going to use the path that we've just added to the service. So let's try that again. And you see we're still getting, a return from the service. Nothing has been secured yet. And that's why we're going to come to the next major concept. We're going to come to the concept of consumers and how they tie into security. So stay tuned. Now that we've set up Kong to work with our FHIR server, it's time to be thinking about securing our server. And Kong offers a rich range of options. I think the natural first step will be to have users authenticate themselves before they can request FHIR resources. So let's take a look at this. How can we secure our FHIR service? There are a number of security plugins that we can use that Kong supplies right out of the box. And I'm going to go ahead and add a plugin here, and you can see there are a variety of ways in which users can be made to authenticate themselves to the service. OAuth 2 is a great way to do that authentication. That requires an identity manager, and we don't have time to discuss that this afternoon. So what I'm going to do is use a pretty good method of authentication called key authentication. I'm going to go ahead and add this plugin with Kong. To use the plugin, we have to have a API key or a field that it'll look for the API key. And I'm just going to make it simple. I'll call this API key. And I'm going to go ahead and add the plugin to the service globally. Now that that plugin has been created, let's see the effect on requesting data from our FHIR service. I'm going to go back to Kong, and I'm going to try to make a API request. I'm going to get rid of the key here and just request data from this main route for patient number 6. And you could see we're going to get a message back from Kong right away that there was no API key found in the request. And it's going to basically give us a 401 unauthorized error. So we need to have an API key, and to do that we have to be a consumer of the service. Now, just in the interest of time, I've set up a couple of consumers for our FHIR service here. And let's assume that we wanted to access everything in the service. We are an admin and we're in the group administrator. And our credentials are, we're going to have obviously an API key. So we'll have Con create that API key for us here. I'm going to submit it and we'll get a nice string that would be hard to memorize. And let's now take that API key and place it into Postman. I'm going to uncheck this field API key and I'm going to paste that in. And now I'm going to make the same request again. And this time you see we are able to get a patient back. So that's good news. We've been able to authenticate users coming into our service. But that may not be enough. We want to do more than authentication. We want to also choose who should be able to come in on a given route. So let's take a look at, can we secure our service even in a more fine-grained way? I'm going to go to our routes, and we have this main route here. And we could add a plugin to this main route as well. We could say, hey, only certain people can come into this route. And I'm going to add another plugin to Kong. And this plugin is going to be a little bit different. We're going to look at role-based authentication. So I want to control which consumers can access this, this route. And what I'm going to say here is the consumers I want to access the route are administrators. So I'm going to add that plugin. And let's make sure it's working again. I'm going to bring back our known administrator here and see if it can make this request and get a response. And you could see it's able to do that. Now let's take a different consumer of the service. So we have ordinary FHIR users. And for the sake of this demonstration, I'm considering that they're in a different group. They're in the general group. Let's make sure they have at least authentication credentials. And they do have an API key. I'm going to copy that key because they need this key to authenticate themselves. But they're in the wrong group, the wrong security group. They're just in the user group. So even though they can, in theory, authenticate against the server, they don't have permissions along this route. So let's go ahead and validate that or verify that with Postman. I'm going to now replace the administrator key with the user key. And let's make that request again. And you now see we're getting a different kind of error message, that even though they're authenticated, they cannot consume this service. So in summary, what have we shown here? Well, we showed that we could both do authentication and authorization, but we've shown a big advantage for API management in dealing with security. You're not going to need to build this into your application. You could use the API manager to do this for you. You can employ the security method of your choice. And as time goes on, you can even change this at will with very little effort. So this concludes this part. I want to show you some more things we could do with Kong before we wrap this up. If our FHIR service is going to be HIPAA compliant, we're going to need to log our requests and responses. And API management can definitely help out with this task. Kong offers a number of plugins that work with a variety of logging services. So let's take a look here. Go ahead and add a plugin. Under logging, you can see we have a lot of different options, including logging to our own file system. And that may be okay in certain situations, but in other situations, you may want to use an external service, potentially providing you with the ability to do searching and analysis of those logs. And that's what I'm going to show you here. We'll establish an HTTP log with a service called Logi. And the endpoint I just happened to paste in here, and we'll add this plugin, and we're good to go. Now we would like to test this, and the easiest way again is with Postman. What we should do here to generate a sufficient number of requests that we could really understand how logging analytics might help is to use the Postman runner, which can run collections for us. And so I'll fire that up here, and it'll take a few seconds, and we'll go to our FHIR request. And as you saw in the demo I just did earlier, we could easily create requests that will give us a 200 code. For example, those that have the correct admin API key, and those that will get an unauthorized response because they're, for example, they're in the users group and they don't have the right permissions. So why don't we do this? We're going to maybe generate 100 iterations of those two requests, and you're going to see they're equally distributed between 4 bidden requests, status code 403, and a admin API key that's present. They get a 200 response. And the Postman collection runner could generate these pretty quickly. We're almost done. And at this point, we could take a look at that in Loggly. So I'll close this. And let's head over to the Loggly website. We'll need to log into our account. They have a free account for a couple weeks. That's what I'm using here. But then you could get a paid account if you want. And now you could see that it's logging our request from Kong, and you could see the status codes for each of the requests, the 403 being access denied code. And we could also do analytics on this. We could see the number of requests coming in, evenly split between the 200 and 403 responses. But this is a great way in which you can manage your logging using a service. Again, you could do this on your local machine. And now I'd like to show you the last piece of deploying a production server, which is monitoring.
And Patrick,
When it's time to put your FHIR server into production, it would be very helpful to have operational monitoring. Kong can help in this area as well. We could add a global plugin that can capture data directly from Kong on the FHIR server's performance locally on my machine. Just going to type in my credentials, admin, and password. There is a little bit of configuration needed to set up Grafana to work with Prometheus, but it's fairly simple since Kong has developed an official dashboard that has a code that you could enter into the system and it will configure your dashboard for you. Now that we've selected a dashboard, we could see operational metrics. Here, I'm going to select a time band that's a little lower so we can see it more clearly. We could see the total requests per second coming into the server. We could see the request based on the route. In this case, we only have one route, so you only see the request coming into the main route. And we could also see then too the different requests and their status codes. So we could see how many of the requests were denied at any given point because they're not authorized, and how many were authorized.
Patrick, I do apologize. We are at time
I'm going
here.
to stop. Yes, okay, I understand. So I'm sorry to everybody who couldn't see the rest of these demos. They're all going to be available on YouTube. So, or if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write me or my colleagues at InterSystems. But we hope you have a great Dev Days, and I'm sure this will be something that we'll be talking much more about. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. And as Patrick mentioned, the Q&A in Whova will be persistent. So if there are questions there that were not answered during this, they will be answered by the moderator and Patrick in the future. So thank you very much for attending, and check your agenda for the next call.
Thank you.